So a little while back, we made a video about inspection reports and whether you can give out an inspection report after a deal busts. And here's the deal. I've got to come back and make a correction because some facts have changed and frankly, I got it wrong. Listen, I am always going to try to be absolutely perfect in everything that I ever say, but I can't promise that I always will. But what I can promise is that if I ever get it wrong, I will absolutely make it right. So a while back, I made a video and said that if you get a copy of inspection reports and the deal busts, that if you give those inspection reports out to a new buyer that comes along, you could be in violation of the real estate code. Turns out that's only partially true. So here's what happened. I got a copy of that consent order from the Real Estate Commission, and that consent order doesn't fully describe what exactly the facts are. So I've now had another opportunity to speak to the Real Estate Commission, and I'm here to set the record straight and give you the new rule for inspection reports, depending on which side of the transaction you're on. So what actually happened in that case is you had a buyer's agent that was trying to help a buyer purchase a house. They got their inspections and the deal ended up busting. So that buyer's agent had a new buyer come along who was interested in the exact same house. And so doing what was really the right thing, she disclosed some of the things that were seen in that inspection report. And again, the heart was in the right place there. And so she gave a copy of that inspection report to this second buyer that came along on the same house. And the problem is the first buyer found out about it and was very upset about it, saying that was my inspection report. They shouldn't have given it out to anybody else. And the Real Estate Commission, in looking at it again, said, yes, your heart was in the right place. Making that disclosure was good. But what should have happened is you should have contacted the first buyer and said, can I give this inspection report to the new buyer? And if they said yes, then great, go ahead and do it. If they said no, that new buyer should go ahead and get their own inspection. So that all's really the same as the previous video, but where I got it wrong is when I read that consent order, and my understanding based on the facts was that this was actually the listing agent that gave out the inspection report. And this is what is so unusual about the fact scenario that was in that original video. Is how weird is it for a buyer's agent to have somebody interested in a property, for that deal to bust, and then have a new buyer interested in the same property? And again, the consent order didn't detail that specific fact, so it kind of flew under the radar. And really what it sounded like to me was the listing agent had received the inspection report and they were giving that out to a new buyer. And again, it just wasn't clear at the time. And so now, after talking to the Real Estate Commission again, we've got the clarification to make sure everybody's clear. Now, the standard real estate contract requires the buyer to give the seller copies of all written inspection reports, and it doesn't say what the seller can do with those. And so after talking with the Real Estate Commission now, it's very clear that we are on the same page, because originally I told you I didn't quite agree with the result that they came to. And so now I've got to eat that crow and tell you that they actually agreed with what I originally thought should be the result. So, hey, great, we're on the same page now. But what really should be happening here is the seller gets a copy of those inspection reports and they do now get to decide what they want to do with them. If they decide they want to give them to a subsequent buyer, well, that's kind of their decision to make, and you as the listing broker can facilitate that. But ultimately, as the listing side, if you give that inspection report to somebody else, a new buyer that comes along, the Real Estate Commission's not going to say that you're in violation of the real estate code. That only is going to apply in the case of a buyer's agent who gives it to a new buyer on that same property. Again, a very unlikely circumstance to come up and pretty rare when that kind of thing happens, which really is what tricked me a little bit. So let's do a quick summary refresh here of our rules for inspection reports after a deal busts. Rule number 1, after the deal busts, if you've got the property listed, make sure that seller updates the property disclosure form with any new defects that were revealed in that inspection. Rule number 2, if you are the listing agent on that transaction and the seller does want you to give a copy of that inspection report to a new buyer, you at least don't have to worry that the Real Estate Commission is going to say you violated the real estate code. Now, if you're on the buyer side of the transaction and a deal busts, don't use that inspection report for a new buyer that comes along on that same property. In that circumstance, the only way you can give that to a new buyer is if the original buyer who paid for it gave you actual written permission to give that inspection report to a new buyer that comes along. I always want to be perfect and never give you bad information, but if it ever happens, I promise you this, I will come back and I will set the record straight. And that's what we're doing here today. That original video, it is in the trash can, it's gone, so that information's out, and this up-to-date information is what you need now. And sorry that I gave you some bad information before. Listen, do you feel bad for me about having to come and make a correction because we gave you some bad information before? Well, then give me a sympathy like down below and a sympathy subscribe. And that way, if I ever have to correct the record again, you're gonna know right off the bat when that's there. So thank you so much, and we appreciate you coming back and checking this out and getting the record straight on this one.